Good evening. In recent days, the conflict in Syria has taken a striking turn of events. A startling attack by rebel forces took control of most of Aleppo, Syria's second largest city, and a place that had been under the control of President Bashar al-Assad since 2016. Well, with Moscow, Washington, London and Berlin all carefully calibrating their responses, tonight we examine how this shift in Syria's situation changes things for the rest of the world. Well, bringing their analysis to bear on this topic are Anita, Sharma and Orkhan Amashov. But first, AnewZ's Aytan Shukurova reports on the developing situation in Syria.
The rebel operation in Syria is the boldest challenge to President Bashar al-Assad in years, breaking a front line frozen since 2020. Rebels captured towns near Aleppo, including Menag, Tel Rifat and Nabil, with many returning locals discovering mines in their homes.
We found a spot nearby and checked it out. We discovered mines. These mines were in someone's house. This is my uncle's house, and these are the mines we found there, so we called some young men to disarm them.
Opposition forces seized the Al-Nayrab military airport on Monday, causing Syrian forces to quickly lose control of large areas. In response, the government sought help from the PKK, YPG, allowing them to gain territory. Meanwhile, a Russian airstrike hit the hospital in Idlib, killing 2 people, according to civil defense. The attack hit a city center area housing 6 healthcare facilities, causing significant damage. Hadi al-Bahra, president of the National Coalition of Syrian Opposition Forces, says the success of retaking land was partly due to Hezbollah and Iran-backed fighters being distracted by the Israeli conflict.
The operation was delayed to the crisis in the area, and especially at the end due to the Lebanese, the Israeli-Lebanese war, where the people and commanders on the ground, they saw it's not good to have it while there is a war in Lebanon. So the moment there were a ceasefire in Lebanon, they found that the opportunity is good for them to start.
The United States says it wants to see a political process to end Syria's civil war as rebel fighters make gains.
United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 called for such a process. The Syrian government has never participated in that process. We continue to call on them to do so. We continue to call on all countries to use their influence to push forward that kind of political process that would lead to a path forward for the Syrian people, where the regime engages with opposition groups. We also believe it would be helpful if Russia and Iran stopped their destabilizing influence inside Syria.
President of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, said on Monday that he hoped the instability in Syria will be concluded with an agreement in line with the demands of the Syrian people.
Son birkaç gündür komşumuz Suriye'de
We are closely monitoring the latest developments in our neighboring country, Syria, emerging during the couple of days. Our foreign minister and head of intelligence are in contact with their counterpart constantly for consultations.
İstişarelerini gerçekleştiriyorlar.
Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian says Iran would support peace and security in the region following talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Syria's escalating situation.
The territorial integrity of all countries is respected, and we shouldn't allow the territorial integrity of any country to be violated under any pretext. As a result, we will do whatever we can to create security and peace and confront terrorists.
Rebels control the northwest, Turkey-backed forces hold the northern strip, and United States-backed Kurdish forces control the northeast. Iranian-backed forces with Russian air support have helped Assad suppress rebels since 2011. The rebel assault on Aleppo is the biggest success for anti-Assad fighters in years.
Well, with more and more countries calling for a political solution, the UN Security Council is convening an emergency session. Trent Murray is in Berlin and has the latest.
Guy, we are tracking a number of official responses to the fast-moving events in Syria. A joint statement from the US, UK, France and Germany said that the current escalation underscored the need for a Syrian-led political solution to the conflict. It also called for the protection of civilians and infrastructure in order to prevent further displacement as well as disruption of humanitarian access. Now, closer to the region, during a long-awaited visit to the UAE, Emirati media report that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman spoke with senior officials in Abu Dhabi about new crises in the Middle East, while Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that he was closely monitoring what was happening in Syria and that Ankara was standing by, ready to do whatever it could to extinguish the fires that were burning in the region. Now, later Tuesday, we understand an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council will be held to discuss the situation. We are being told that meeting was requested by the government of Syria and supported by 3 African countries, Mozambique, Sierra Leone and Algeria. Trent Murray for AnewZ, Berlin.
Meanwhile, Moscow says it stands firm in support of the Syrian government and is closely following the unfolding situation. The Pentagon says the US military has activated a communication channel with Russia on the recent developments in Syria. Our correspondent, Dasha Chernyshyova, has more on Russia's position.
Guy, the Kremlin says it continues to support Syrian President Bashar al-Assad as the situation continues to escalate in Syria. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Moscow is analyzing the situation at different levels and Russia's position will be formed on what is needed for stabilizing the country. Russian President Vladimir Putin has also discussed the situation in Syria with his Iranian counterpart Masoud Pezeshkian. Pezeshkian vowed cooperation with Moscow to help resolve the crisis, according to a Kremlin statement. Moscow also says the two sides stressed the importance of coordinating efforts within the Astana format with the participation of Turkey. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov held a meeting with Syrian ambassador to Russia Bashar Jafari and expressed Moscow's solidarity with the Syrian leadership, adding that Russia supports Damascus stabilization efforts. The Syrian Ministry of Defense said Syrian and Russian jets hit what they described as terrorist positions in the east of Aleppo province, killing and wounding dozens of terrorists and destroying equipment. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed its air forces are assisting the Syrian army, acting on this side of the government in the fight against rebels who are conducting the offensive in the north of the country. Pentagon spokesman Patrick Ryder said this week that the American military used a communication channel with Russia for Syria. Moscow has always supported Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity and has called for strengthening joint efforts to stabilize the situation in the country within the framework of Astana format. Dasha Chernyshyova in Moscow for AnewZ.
Well, there are strong views on all sides of this developing situation. Let's have a listen now to Dr. Hisham Helia of the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies. He's concerned about the prospect of a disproportionate response by the Syrian authorities.
I think he goes for full brutality. I think he will try to crush the rebel advance in whatever way that he can. The question will be whether or not he comes to the conclusion that he won't be able to, hence he's got to engage in some sort of political process. I think it's too early to tell that. I think that over the coming few days or so, we'll see how strong his reinforcements are actually going to be, and that will define how he moves forward from there. When it comes from the Russians, he's likely to get more than the Iranians, partly because I think the Israelis will try to strike any Iranian redeployment to Syria, less out of trying to help the rebels against Bashar al-Assad. Actually, they've made it very clear that they prefer Assad's regime to continue to survive, but more a concern that those sorts of redeployments could eventually threaten them. I think Russia will try hard, and the question will be, how much are they willing to do, considering they have Ukraine to be concerned about, and of course they're now, concerned about.
Anita, the balance of power has clearly changed in Syria. What are the immediate consequences then for President Assad?
Well, that's a great question, Guy. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you and Orkhan to discuss this very developing situation, if you will, and certainly one that is challenging in every which way possible. We know that Assad essentially lost control over Aleppo. It's the second largest city in Syria, very, very strategic for this particular government. Back in 2015, it was Russia, as we all know, that launched the military intervention, if you will, in Syria to help Assad's army essentially regain control, because we know Assad's army was on the verge of defeat. Moscow and Tehran collectively helped Assad recapture Aleppo. This was successful and complete by 2016. However, now, gentlemen, we know that it is a very different landscape in Syria, and not just in Syria, but in Russia as well, as it pertains to the Ukraine war, which we'll get to right now. We know that Russia cannot rely on the Wagner Group as it used to in the past to provide some support in Syria. We know that Russia is tied up in Ukraine. It's a war that's gone on longer than the world expected, and certainly longer than Russia had expected. It cannot send significant military reinforcements to the Syrian government forces. That's very significant. In turn, we know that Assad is now relying on Iran. That in and of itself shouldn't be a problem, right? Iran should be able to come to Assad's defense, if you will. In fact, December 2nd, Guy, we know that it was Iranian-backed militias that essentially entered Syria to help Assad's government stabilize its regime. Here are the questions now, though. After the Ukraine war has started, the Kremlin, we know, has lost key members of CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, if you will. A lot of pundits, and I'm sure perhaps here as well, will ask the question, could it perhaps lose Syria as well, depending on how this all unfolds, depending on if Assad cannot once again regain control of a key region, a key city like Aleppo? No doubt this could and would challenge Assad's relationship with Russia moving forward. So that's certainly something we're keeping an eye out for right now.
And Orkhan, let's just delve into that strategic significance of Aleppo a little bit more. A key city, a key location, and the speed with which this attack happened, I think, took a lot of people by surprise.
Absolutely, Guy, because it's called actually lightning offensive. For many, this was an element of surprise. It came as a surprise to many. But those people who understand the region very well, in particular those who keep the eye on the developments involving Russia, Iran and Turkey, would say that actually it had been in the offing for some considerable time. Turkish experts are saying that this particular lightning offensive should have been conducted 7 weeks ago, but it was delayed. The reason for that is Astana summit and the process there involving Russia, Turkey and Iran. So Turks really were back then, according to the information that we received from Turkish experts, were suggesting that Bashar should come to terms with the opposition fractions and some kind of compromise could be achieved in order to envision the future of Syria. But it looks like that under the pressure of Russia and Iran, Assad government did not react. And actually, Russia and Iran were not in favor of this proposition in the first place, because Assad, to be absolutely honest, at this juncture, is not able to act on his own volition. And effectively, he's very much reliant on Russia and Iran. And then, of course, under the circumstances, what happened last week did give a completely new character to the circumstances enveloping Syria now, because this conflict which started back in 2011, escalated throughout 2013, 14, 15, 16, but effectively since 2020, it has been dormant. I mean, with the exception of some sporadic flare-ups, but effectively Turkish-Russian brokered ceasefire deal has been sort of functioning over the past 4 years, and the impression given was that Assad would be able to control substantial majority of the country. All of this talk about him being removed under the influence of the opposition and external pressure was effectively ditched. And we were all talking about some sort of compromise between opposition and the government of Bashar al-Assad. Now, what was dormant for many, many years has been reignited. And Assad has lost some ground. Aleppo is incredibly important, the second biggest city of the country. And after Aleppo, of course, there's another city, which is the fourth biggest city of Syria, Hama, may fall to opposition. Composition of the Syrian opposition is very complicated there. And all of those, their names change all the time. And today I was interviewing one gentleman from Beirut. We were talking about Syrian National Army, Syrian Defense Force. I think we should be very careful with this abbreviation because they fluctuate all the time, or what was meant to be associated with certain terrorist group after certain stage is associated with some freedom fighters, so that terminology should be treated very, very, very carefully. But what is very clear at this stage that, as I said earlier, what was dormant has changed, it's reignited, and Assad is very much worried at this stage because he cannot be reliant on Iran and Russia. Russia is on the back foot in the region, of course. It's very much preoccupied in Ukraine. Iran, after what happened in Lebanon, after that ceasefire deal concluded between Israel and Hezbollah, is on the back foot. And we know that all of those territories that HTS now controls previously had been controlled by Iran-linked militia groups. So that effectively means that when you look at the Iranian influence within the scope of Syria geographically, that influence is being diminished. Russia is still helping Syria in terms of airstrikes, but are they effective enough? Of course, they have led to humanitarian casualties, and these casualties should be taken into account. There's a massive humanitarian problem in Syria, which is not going to fade away anytime soon. But militarily, in terms of propping Assad up, I think Russia's ability is being curbed at this stage. Will it lead to anything consequential in the near future? It's another question. Of course, we'll discuss it a bit later. But what happened is very consequential because for many, over the past few years, the dominant feeling was that Assad, for all of his problems, is still in charge of the country. 70% of the country is controlled by the government based in Damascus, but 30% are controlled by other militia groups, and with the northeastern part under YPG, Kurdish-related groups, and northeastern groups by those forces which are believed to be backed by Turkey.
To what extent then, Orkhan, do you think that the big countries that are involved in this, providing backing, the US, Turkey, Iran, to what extent will they be looking at rethinking, recalibrating their strategies?
The Western governments are very, very careful now in terms of their intervention. They believe that they should constrain themselves, and Turkey should play an important role. But Turkey does see in this Western proposition elements of danger, because Syria, in a wider sense of the word as a country, is a can of worms for wider involvement. For Turkey, it's absolutely vital to protect its own interests, and currently it is vital within the confines, within the principle of protecting Syria's territorial integrity. What Turkey needs to do, force the government of Bashar al-Assad to talk to those opposition fighters and provide the ground for further resolution of the current Syrian conflict. And I think that will be the Turkish position which will be pursued from now on.
And Anita, let's just focus on the US. Difficult time. We're in between the Biden administration, the new Trump administration.
For sure.
What's the US thinking? What does it do next?
It's a fair question. I think for quite some time now, the US, for lack of a better term, has been rather happy, or maybe somewhat satisfied, I'll say, to have Bashar al-Assad manage the country. But now, as various correspondents as well as Orkhan have reiterated, U.S., France, Germany, and the UK collectively have put out a notice essentially saying, look, we are closely monitoring the situation and the developments in Syria. We are urging de-escalation by all parties. Of course, they want to see some level of balance, some level of calmness in the region. Will that be possible, though, Guy and Orkhan? That's the question that remains to be seen. The sustained escalation in Syria is risking further destabilization in a region that's already been pummeled by the Gaza and Lebanon wars. We know, as Orkhan alluded to, that a truce was called between Israel and the Hezbollah militant group. It took effect last week, but we also know that that truce was essentially broken last night. So what's going to happen moving forward? We don't know. You asked about Trump. Do we really know what's going to happen when he takes office in January? We know that he has a pro-U.S. policy, U.S. first. We know that he is very, very interested in focusing on moving the U.S. forward and having less of a reliance, he's made no secret about this, less of a reliance and less of being a supportive character with respect to NATO and other organizations. So what does this mean when Trump comes in? That's a very good question. But we do know, going back to his last time when he was president of the United States, there was a lot more, if you will, consternation, right? He would basically go out on his app of choice, his social media app of choice, at that time known as Twitter, now known as X, and he would essentially put out his bulletins there with respect to how he viewed various regions in the world and really let the countries themselves sort of cope with his comments on social media. So moving forward, it's a big question to see how the Trump administration will deal with what's happening here. Big question is, will this continue to escalate in the hours and days ahead? That, of course, cannot be good news for Bashar al-Assad for all the reasons we've mentioned here, and given the fact that Israel has been just pressuring significantly Iran's Hezbollah allies. It's been happening over the past 2 months. So where Assad is looking for key support, whether it be Russia, whether it be Iran, those are areas now that it may have to reconsider. And what does that moving forward? Well, I guess that's where the pundits come in.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess the strategy is one factor, but also there's a reality for the people living on the ground, Orkhan. There was already a humanitarian crisis in Syria. The likelihood is that that will now be exacerbated. What can be done to mitigate the devastating effect of things like this on people's real lives?
Well, I think what should be done now is to provide a safe humanitarian corridor for people to leave those affected areas. But one-off solutions could be considered, of course, but perhaps we should think in terms of providing a wider solution to the Syrian conflict in order to deal with the humanitarian problem as well, because the conflict has been ongoing for the past 13 years. The last 4 years had been dormant, but the conflict now has been reignited. Of course, United Nations, other organizations are working very hard in Syria, and there are certain restricted areas that they cannot enter as well. But perhaps some sort of compromise between the opposition fighters whose composition remain fluctuating on a regular basis, and the government could be considered, because there has been some change of emphasis regarding Syria over the past few years. Before, everybody, in particular before 2020, of course, they had been talking about the government. They were referring the term, of course, using the term regime in connection with government of Syria is still the case, but the imminent overthrow of the government of Bashar Assad was really something which was central to the political statements made by Western governments before, but no longer this is the case. Now we talk about reconciliation between the Syrian government and the opposition factions. Within this context, of course, we shouldn't forget about the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which does endorse Syria's territorial integrity, and also humanitarian matters are enshrined within that resolution as well. But what seems to be the absolute imminent necessity to do now, of course, to address those humanitarian issues. The question there is it's a very fundamental question. Now, bearing in mind that the conflict has reignited again, what does this signify? Is it a new phase of the conflict management, or is it actually new phase of escalation which could lead to the unlocking of the crisis? There are those who believe that the latter should be taken into account as an imminent possibility, because on occasion, when you have this uncomfortable stalemate lasting for years, this frozen state of conflict, something dramatic should happen in order for the factors on the ground to change, enabling the parties to envision new way out. And I think this is something that we are currently observing in Syria, because clearly Iran is on the back foot. Russian airstrikes are not effective as they should be from the way the Moscow sees those airstrikes. And Turkey has got its own security concern in line with which it is acting. And we have been told, we are given to understand on the basis of our interviews and also on the basis of reports we are receiving from the region, that currently the government of Bashar al-Assad is considering the possibility of talking to Turks. She is definitely feeling under too much pressure to plod on under the current circumstances. Perhaps in this element we could see a way out.
A way out, Anita. No plodding on, as Orkhan puts it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really interesting point, especially at the end here. Where do these talks go moving forward? We know that an Iranian minister has essentially said that, look, upcoming talks will be taking place between Turkey and Russia. So you have Iran essentially coming in and saying, okay, we're going to pick up the baton here and try to find some middle ground. That's what I'm reading between the lines here. Try to find some middle ground, something that gives presumably Assad a leg up in this, what is now turning out to be a very dire situation. We talked about the rebels, Guy, essentially advancing north of Hamas City. We know that all these key countries have vested interests in this region, in this country, US, Turkey, Iran, Russia, all having key interests. A very crowded battlefield, if you will, especially in northeast Syria. My question moving forward, we touched on HTS, which is part of one of the forces, one of the groups that is essentially helping the rebel groups push against Bashar al-Assad's regime. How is this going to play out with the United States? This, many, I believe, are seeing as a very big factor. We know the U.S. supports the rebel groups that are fighting Assad, but the HTS is on a U.S. terrorist list. So how essentially is all this going to play out moving forward? Because as the U.S. presumably will want to lend support in any which way, shape, or form, that's for many to talk about, with the rebel forces against Assad, knowing that the HTS is on that team, how will the U.S. in fact proceed moving forward? I think that's going to be quite critical too.
Yeah, I think that we have to take into account tactical alliances and also strategic picture. It is quite possible for, given tactical reason, to cooperate with a group whose credentials are less than plausible and positive. But in the long run, of course, all of these things may be forgotten and they could be ditched as well. We have seen this particular element prevalent in Syria and other Middle Eastern countries, of course. We understand that northwest Syria is currently controlled by that group that you mentioned, HTS. Right. We know about their former affiliation, Al-Qaeda, the connection. They disowned that connection back in 2017, but they are a prescribed terrorist organization, of course, and that puts a special complexion on the whole issue, because their ambition, actually, stated ambition, is to topple the government of Assad and also to create some kind of Islamic governance there, which does not confirm with the interest pursued by Turkey in that region, and of course wouldn't go hand in hand with what US and other Western governments want to see in that region. But I suppose in the world of tactical alliances, all of these things should be treated in a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm. And talking of tactical alliances, what about the impact on the region? it comes at a time of incredible sensitivity. What's your reflection, Orkhan, when you think about Lebanon, you think about Israel? Yeah. Will this make the situation much worse, or could it present some tactical opportunities?
It's a very interesting question, Guy, it's a very interesting question. It deserves an interesting answer. I cannot guarantee the latter, but the former is a foregone conclusion. It could potentially lead to something very positive. If the government of Bashar al-Assad is compelled to talk to opposition forces and achieve some sort of compromise, which is probably wishful thinking at this juncture, that could unlock the current tasteless stalemate in many ways. Or alternatively, it could exacerbate circumstances there, leading to more humanitarian casualties, which is also a likely possibility. Quite a lot is happening at this juncture across the globe. Earlier, Anita and we reported about developments taking place in Kosovo, for example.
That's right.
There was a blast last Friday, and there's a talk about the rising tensions between the Pristina and Belgrade. We also noticed developments taking place in Georgia, where the election results are contested by the opposition forces, with EU being very much supportive of the opposition and very much against the current Georgian government. We also see developments on the Hezbollah-Israel front, for example, where we have some element of ceasefire, which could potentially lead to something plausible in the fullness of time. We see Russia being very preoccupied in Ukraine, and the Biden administration is going through its latter stage, and Trump will take over. All of this talks about tariffs and so on. So one wonders at certain moments whether, to what extent, what is currently taking place in Ukraine, in Kosovo, in Syria, could be deemed as interconnected. But as long as Syria itself is concerned as a country, it is torn into pieces. Syria, whatever we may think of the government of Bashar al-Assad, some people use the word regime, some people use even both terminology in connection with Bashar al-Assad, but that state is a failed state. There should be some element of compromise between the internal forces in order to achieve something which could lead to a prosperous future of Syria. Bearing in mind that the removal of Bashar al-Assad is not in the offing, I guess that what is happening now in northeastern and northwestern Syria should lead to some form of negotiations which could eventually see the reconciliation, because the drastic set of actions leading to Assad's fall, I don't think is feasible from the perspective of Turkey and other Western countries. And territorial integrity of Syria should be protected. This is the primary consideration.
Well, Anita.
We were talking about the various discussions, Guy, that Orkhan and I have had over the last few days, including today, right, Orkhan? We're basically talking about the African continent earlier. That interview will air. Actually, I believe it's already aired, and maybe you can catch it on social media. But essentially, the discussion we were having with the pundit there was, okay, we know that the U.S. is trying to strengthen its relationship, in this particular case, Angola, but of course, Africa on the whole. And it was very interesting how the pundit had mentioned that, once again, Russia came up. Russia seems to have somewhat of a waning influence in that region. Sure, China seems to be taking a step back, perhaps for now, maybe a minor step, and maybe the U.S. is trying to capitalize on that. But with respect to geopolitical tensions around the world, is it connected? Is it not? Not for me to say, but it sure is very interesting what's happening now with respect to geopolitical developments around the world. There isn't an area that seems isn't touched here. We're talking about Africa. We're talking about the U.S. wanting once again to establish a proper relationship with Africa, as it seems China's pulling back. What is Russia's role there? That's a big question to be asked right now. As the Ukraine war carries on, how can Russia continue to help its allies on the front line? They all beg further introspection. There's no doubt about it in the days and weeks ahead. It's a fascinating time.
Well, more introspection needed. Unfortunately, not for us tonight. Thank you both for your analysis, as always.
Thank
and
you.
thank you, too, for watching. That is all we have time for on this hour. Do stay with us on AnewZ for much more news and analysis, and we wish you a very pleasant evening ahead.